Finish this probably about.
It's time for The Verdict. The Verdict is a lively discussion of current events and legal issues pertinent to Oklahomans. The Verdict is hosted by Kent Myers and Mick Cornett. The Verdict is sponsored in part by the Able Law Firm. It's time for The Verdict.
And welcome once again to The Verdict. I'm Mick Cornett, and I am joined, as always, by one of Oklahoma's top legal experts, Kent Myers. Okay.
It's time for The Verdict. The Verdict is a lively discussion of current events and legal issues pertinent to Oklahomans. The Verdict is hosted by Kent Myers and Mick Cornett. The Verdict is sponsored in part by the Able Law Firm. It's time for The Verdict.
And welcome once again to The Verdict. I'm Mick Cornett, and I am joined, as always, by one of Oklahoma's top legal experts, Kent Myers. Kent, a distinguished guest today.
We have a guest that we're very proud could come on the show. Is Chief Judge Larry Joplin, the Chief Judge of the Oklahoma Court of Civil Appeals. For most of our viewers, the Oklahoma Court of Civil Appeals will be the most important appellate court that our viewers will ever come in contact with. Some might have thought that would be the Oklahoma Supreme Court. For some of our viewers, it might be the Court of Criminal Appeals, but for the people who have civil difficulties, the court we're going to be talking about today decides finally most of the cases in Oklahoma. So it's a very important court. It finishes our series on the 3 appellate courts in Oklahoma, and we're looking forward to having Judge Joplin join us here in just a second.
Well, let's get to it. This morning, Judge Larry Joplin, the Chief Judge of the Oklahoma Court of Civil Appeals. It's next on The Verdict.
Yeah, right over here.
And welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers is going to introduce our guest.
It is a genuine pleasure today to have the Honorable Larry Joplin, Chief Judge of the Oklahoma Court of Civil Appeals, with us in the 3rd of our 3-part series on Oklahoma appellate courts. Judge Joplin is a native of Oklahoma City. He was educated both at the University of Oklahoma in his undergraduate work and the University of Oklahoma College of Law. He engaged in private practice of law for a number of years, was also a prosecutor, and in 1994 was appointed to the Court of Civil Appeals as one of the judges. He's an adjunct professor of law at the University of Oklahoma, and since January of this year has been the Chief Judge of the Oklahoma Court of Civil Appeals. Judge Joplin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Kent.
We're really pleased to have you.
Proud to be here.
The Oklahoma Court of Civil Appeals is a court that's probably not known by many of our viewers, but as I indicated at the beginning, quite an important court. What is the role or the mission of the Oklahoma Court of Civil Appeals?
The Oklahoma Supreme Court handles all of the civil cases, and the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals handles all the criminal cases. The Oklahoma Supreme Court, from before statehood until 1970, was the only appellate court for civil cases. In 1970, there was created the Court of Appeals to help reduce the backlog in the civil cases. Cases that were ready and were issued but couldn't be gotten to because there were so many. So in the judicial reform of '67, it authorized the creation of an intermediate court of appeals, and that's what we do, and it's existed since 1970.
Do many other states have an intermediate court of
Right, I
civil
think
appeals?
the federal system does, of course, and I think almost all states do have an intermediate appellate court. You need that in these days with all of the litigation and with all the appeals and the time it takes. So,
Well, how many judges are there in the Court of Civil Appeals?
there are 12. There are 6 who sit in Oklahoma City and 6 who sit in Tulsa.
How are they divided up?
They're divided into 3 judge panels. We have 4 3-judge panels, and we sit and decide these cases with 2 other judges, which those panels rotate on a yearly basis also.
Let's bring up a graphic, a little oversimplified, I think, but I think it will tell us what we need to learn about how cases get to the Oklahoma appellate court system. I take it the district court is the trial court of general jurisdiction, and once either a criminal conviction or a civil judgment has been rendered, then the case will go up either to the Court of Criminal Appeals or the Oklahoma Supreme Court, and then the Oklahoma Supreme Court will refer back to your court, quite a few of them for handling, will they not?
Yes, I think as a practical matter, it's almost all civil cases are referred back to our court. The Supreme Court certainly keeps the initiative petitions, the important constitutional questions, all of the writs. But for the most part, everything else is sent these days to the Court of Civil Appeals for determination initially.
Approximately of the cases that come up out of the district court for review, how many of them, or what percentage of them, get sent to your court?
I think as a practical matter, it's probably around, 90% or so.
How do you determine which division is going to get the case? Is it where the crime is committed or where the case is filed? Or how does all that work?
No, it used to be that way, sort of. If the case arose out of a court in Oklahoma County, it would be sent to the Tulsa Court of Appeals. But that's been several years now. These days, it's assigned by the Supreme Court on a random basis, approximately half to the Tulsa division and half to the Oklahoma City division, with no regard to where the case arose.
Does it matter which judge gets the case? How is that going to be determined ultimately?
Once it's assigned by the Supreme Court to our court in Oklahoma City division, for example, we have a system where the cases are categorized: juvenile cases, workers' compensation cases, corporation commission, district court cases. Then they're assigned on a rotating basis to each judge, so that at the end of the year, each judge gets approximately the same amount of workers' comp cases, juvenile cases, district court cases, but they're just assigned at random, so there's no opportunity then to influence which judge gets his particular case.
So there's no system where Oklahoma Court of Civil Appeals Judge number 1, whomever that might be, develops an expertise in workers' comp and therefore gets all the workers' comp cases.
That happens in some courts, but it doesn't happen in the Court of Civil Appeals.
How does the timing, are you all have a backlog of cases? What's the usual time frame?
From the time the case gets to us, now of course by the time it gets to us, it may have been in the system for a year, from the times it takes to file the appeal and to get the transcripts and to do the briefs and to make sure all the motions are in order. But from when it's received by us, we are fairly good about getting the cases out within 90 or 120 days for the most part.
Has that been historically true? Or?
No, we've been able to reduce the backlog over the last few years, and that's pretty much what we're aiming for. Now, of course, that's not always true, and people like Kent, who are involved in big cases, those cases take longer. There'll be a number of boxes, and the transcripts are huge. But for the most part, we are certainly trying to get all the cases out within 120 days.
Let's talk about the judges of the court itself. How are they selected?
It's the same for the Supreme Court, the Court of Criminal Appeals, and the Court of Civil Appeals. You go through the Judicial Nominating Commission, which I know you're aware of, having served on that commission a few years ago. And the commission then takes all of the applicants and narrows it down and picks 3 names, which are then sent to the governor, and then the governor picks one of those 3. So the process for the Court of Civil Appeals is identical to the Supreme Court and the Court of Criminal Appeals.
And then once you've been initially selected, how do you stay on the court? Do you have to run for re-election?
There's what we have in Oklahoma is the retention ballot, which is such a better system than the one in Texas where they run by parties and raise money. Here the voters are asked every 6 years, shall Larry Joplin be retained in office? Shall whatever judge be retained, and voters say yes or no. And as you not run against anyone else, you don't campaign, you don't raise funds. It's just a simple sense of, has this person, if you know anything about them, done a good job? And perhaps if you don't know anything about them, that's an indication they've probably done a good job. And so the percentages vary, but they're almost always the same for every judge who's on the ballot each year.
Has there ever been a judge that was not retained?
Not in Oklahoma. It's happened in some states, but since we've had the retention ballot since 1970, so far the voters have retained all of the judges.
Let me jump in here and get us to a break. We're visiting with Judge Larry Joplin. You're watching The Verdict. Cornett and Kent Myers back on The Verdict. This week's guest is Judge Larry Joplin. Kent, where to next?
I'd like to talk a little bit about the geographic requirements for serving on the Court of Civil Appeals. You have to live in a certain district, do you not?
Yes. When the court was originally created in 1970, there were one judge per the 6 congressional districts that existed at that time. In '82, they increased it to 2 judges per congressional district. So there were 6 congressional districts, so there are 2 from each district, and you're required to be a resident of that particular congressional district.
Now, when we lost a congressman and went from 6 to 5, that didn't change the selection procedure or the residence requirement.
No, the statutes provide that they will remain the same as they were in 1990, so there will be 6 for the time being.
What is the reversal rate?
You mean from the district court?
Well, actually, both ways. When it comes to you, what's the chances of your court reversing a decision that you've been handed?
You understand that our job, of course, is to make sure the rules are followed and that the trial was fair, so that there's a presumption, of course, that all things being equal, that the trial court got it right, that the jury got it right, so that there is a sense that what we look for is just to make sure there are violations. I would have thought, and I looked at some numbers just earlier this week, probably our affirmance rate, the rate where we found that the trial courts did it right, would be somewhere around 80–85%. I was surprised to find that it's actually, if you count all of the ways in which cases can be reversed, affirmed in part, reversed in part, that it was around 65 or 70% that we affirmed, and which was a little lower than I would have thought without having looked into the last couple of years' numbers. But essentially, not surprisingly, most appellate courts, most of the time, find that the trial judges, the juries got it right.
Well, let me ask a related question. When a judge is considering overturning a lower court's ruling, is there verbal communication between the 2 levels of courts, or is it just reading the decisions?
Right. No, there's no verbal communication at all. We just read the briefs and the transcripts and the motions that are filed by the parties.
You don't go have lunch?
No.
You don't call and say, Judge, why did you do that?
No.
As much as you might be tempted to.
No, right, no, we don't.
Well, the other half of Mick's question, let me follow up on, and that is, once the Oklahoma Court of Civil Appeals has made a decision, then, assuming the Supreme Court grants certiorari on that case, they can affirm or reverse the Court of Civil Appeals. Just how often is a decision of the Court of Civil Appeals reversed by the Supreme Court?
One of the interesting facts, of course, is that while the Court of Civil Appeals is probably the least well-known of the appellate courts, in fact, it is disposing of a great many, most of all, of the civil cases, because there is no automatic appeal from our court. You file a petition asking the Supreme Court to take it, and in their discretion, they may or may not take it. And they are granting cert, agreeing to review that case, in somewhere between 13 and 15% of the cases, so that the Court of Civil Appeals winds up being the court of last resort in about 85% of the civil cases. Now, your question is, once the Supreme Court takes it,
yes,
what are the how often do they affirm or reverse the Court of Civil Appeals. Since it's a discretionary appeal, since they don't have to take it, that just by the very nature of their having agreed to take it is some indication that they probably either want a different result, or they may want the same result but for different reasons, or it is such an important case that they want their court's decision to be final on that matter. I think probably if you think in terms of taking a case from the Court of Civil Appeals and coming up with a different result, I would say that's probably 50% of the time of the cases they take. If you think in terms of coming to the same result but writing it different, I think of that sort of as an affirmance anyway. But by the very nature, they're not going to take cases that they don't have some interest initially in and thinking we need to take a look at this case.
What's the background of a Court of Appeals judge? Where did you come from?
Currently, the 12 judges on the Court of Civil Appeals, probably you could divide it up into 3 different categories. There are those who come from private practice. There are those who have prior judicial service, been a trial judge in the district court level somewhere. And then another group of judges who have worked for appellate court judges. They were law clerks for the Supreme Court or Court of Appeals judges. We also have been former prosecutors on the court too, but primarily it's judicial service either as a judge or as a law clerk or private practice.
Let me change the subject just a minute and focus on oral argument. Many lawyers who practice think that the most demanding and most fun part of the trial practice of law would be the oral argument procedure in the appellate court. I know the Supreme Court has oral arguments occasionally on cases, and I know your court has oral arguments on cases occasionally, not on every one. How do you decide which cases where you're going to hear oral argument?
You know, in the federal system, of course, you almost always get an oral argument, and in a lot of states, it's a part of the culture. In Oklahoma, for many reasons, it has never been part of the culture. The bar has never demanded it, and the court's never felt necessary to do it. So that at our court, it's fairly rare to have an oral argument. We do it in those cases where we really believe that an oral argument would be helpful. As you know, in the federal system, they schedule in the 10th Circuit, and sometimes it's just pro forma. But we do it in those cases where we think this question is so unique or it's so hard or the briefs don't fully answer the question that we really need to learn more, and we schedule oral arguments. I would say the court, the Oklahoma City and Tulsa divisions, may have an oral argument 3 or 4 times a year.
Let me change the subject again just a minute. I know the Supreme Court, when they decide a case, they all get together and all 9 vote. And when the Court of Criminal Appeals does it, all 5 vote. When your court decides an appeal, do all 12 get together and vote?
No. We work in 3-judge panels so that one judge will work on a case and draft up a proposed opinion, take it to conference. The other judges will look at it. If you can get another vote, that then becomes the opinion of the Court of Civil Appeals. If you can't, then one of the other judges will take it and write it a different way. But it would just work in 3-judge panels, and there is no provision for the Court of Civil Appeals to then meet en banc.
How does a judge deal with a prior relationship that he may have had with one of the attorneys or the law firm that's handling a case?
Well, there are certain statutory requirements. If you were in a law firm and a case was there while you were in that law firm, you shouldn't participate in it. If you were a trial judge, of course, and that case is now on appeal, you shouldn't participate in it. But I think what you're asking is, aside from those statutory requirements, how do you as an individual judge decide that? And I think mostly everyone's aware of not wanting to even have the appearance of having any favoritism in it. So I think we all pretty much go out of the way to make sure that, at least the ones I know about do, we don't take cases from our prior firm and so forth. Not that we couldn't, but just since we have 12 judges and it's easy enough to have some other judge participate, it makes more sense to not participate in them at all.
We have run out of time, and it sure went quickly today. Judge Joplin, thank you very much for coming by.
Thank you for having me.
Kent and I'll be back with a few final thoughts when we return. You're watching The Verdict. Mick Cornett and Kent Myers back to wrap up another edition of The Verdict. And Judge Joplin was very responsive to our questions. I was impressed by his knowledge and everything he had to say.
Well, he's been a credit to the court, as I've known him many years, and he's been a credit every place he's been. We were kind of giggling at that last quote that came up there about no wonder the person said that is marked as unknown. Nobody'd want their name to be attributed to that quote. This finishes up for our viewers the third in the three-part series of the Oklahoma Appellate Courts. We hope it's been instructive for you. We have enjoyed it doing it ourselves. We have a very efficient appellate court system in Oklahoma. Our caseload is turned around much more quickly than most states, and we can be proud of the job that the courts do and the speed with which they do it, and we're glad we were able to bring the top judges on all three courts to our viewers the last 3 weeks.
All right. Well, we want to drive people also to our website, theverdict.tv. You can go there and send us an email and give us a topic that you'd like to see us discuss on a future show. Thanks again to our guest, Judge Larry Joplin. For Kent Myers, I'm Mick Cornett. We'll see you next time on The Verdict.
You've been watching The Verdict with Kent Myers and Mick Cornett. The Verdict is sponsored in part by the Able Law Firm,